Thank you for joining us at the CEO Morning Jolt. This is a forum for sharing insights for emerging growth companies to grow and scale, and we're very happy that you're here. I'm Sherry Sklar. I'm the co-founder of GrowthTerra and a co-host of this program. Janine and I started GrowthTerra to help leaders of emerging growth companies achieve extraordinary growth, profit, and impact. And research shows that maximizing the value of all your stakeholder relationships, especially the ones that are, sitting in your board, is really going to make a difference in terms of the value of your company. So we have a great panel assembled today to talk about CEOs and founders and how they can get the most out of their boards. Very excited to have you all here. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize our sponsors. Thank you to Perkins Coie, our premier sponsor. Perkins Coie is named one of the best law firms for startups in VC and privacy law by Vault, and they've been ranked a tier 1 law firm for venture capital, corporate law, tech, and IP by US News. And also thank you for our supporting sponsor, Exceed Sales. Exceed Sales specializes in helping companies execute their lead gen and their inside sales organizations. And I also wanted to take a moment and share with you about a great organization, Resolution Project. The reason why we wanted to highlight this is that Resolution Project develops and empowers young leaders so that they can pursue socially responsible solutions to issues affecting communities around the world. We are big supporters of this organization. If you're looking for an organization to help that you want to be able to help contribute to help make a difference, this is a great one. Go to resolutionproject.org. Now I'd like to turn it over to my co-founder, Janine. And let me just introduce Janine. Janine is a career that has been all about tech. She has a wealth of experience being a pioneer and launching disruptive technologies like mobile satellite communications and voice over IP. She's worked in both large companies like Deloitte and Arthur Andersen and Nokia, as well as startups and emerging growth companies. And her knowledge of how to raise the performance of the entire business stems from her in-depth experience from all types of functional areas: marketing, strategy, operations, M&A, human resources. There's so much about Janine that is special, but it's this ability to take all of that experience and create a 360-degree view that has helped all of our companies raise their performance enormously. So Janine is our president, but she's also our Chief WOW Officer. Janine works with clients to deliver WOW for both their customers as well as for their employees, because companies that deliver both, WOW to both actually achieve greater growth. Janine has held multiple board positions over the years, including being a past president of the Children's Aid Society of Ottawa, Carleton. And I just have to say she's a superstar. And she enables companies to wow all their stakeholders, from customers to employees, to partners, to investors, and to board of directors. She's the best person I know to moderate this panel. So over to you, Janine.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you for that kind and humbling introduction. Good morning, everyone. And I'm really excited about our discussion today, because being a founder and a CEO is a really challenging job. You've got many stakeholders to manage, not, ones that you may not have thought about when you had your great idea and were just raring to take it to the market. You have your customers, which you expect. You have employees, which you expect. But now you also have investors, and those investors are represented by your board. And every CEO that I know, no matter what the size of the company, always stresses about the relationship with the board. Reporting to a committee of people is much different than having a single boss. And every CEO knows and founder knows that having a supportive board is key to the growth and success of their company. But building that relationship takes a lot of hard work. And so the panel today is here, and we've got 3 great perspectives: the perspective of a CEO, the perspective of a venture capitalist, and the perspective of an attorney general counsel, to share their experiences and insights and lessons learned so that you can take those away to help you build a positive, productive board relationship. So let me introduce our panel. First, David Klein. David is the CEO and co-founder of Common Bond. a leading fintech company that offers a suite of student loan-based solutions to both consumers and enterprises. And Common Bond has funded over $3 billion worth of loans for over 250,000 customers. It's been included in the world's 50 most innovative companies list by Fast Company, Time's 50 Genius Companies list, and the Forbes FinTech 50 list. Welcome, David. Brian Hirsch. Brian is the co-founder and managing partner of Tribeca Venture Partners. Brian's got more than 20 years of experience in the venture business. He's invested across a broad number of sectors throughout his career, including fintech, enterprise and SMB SaaS, marketplaces, healthcare, MarTech, and real estate tech. Brian is currently responsible for 16 Tribeca Venture Partners investments, including Common Bond. Welcome, Brian. And Jeffrey Silverman. Jeff is an associate attorney with Perkins Coie. Jeff represents emerging companies across multiple industries from formation to exit. He advises his clients on general corporate, business, and contractual matters as their outside general counsel. And he also works closely with companies to plan, structure, and achieve complex financing transactions, acquisitions, recapitalizations, carve-outs, strategic investments, joint ventures, as well as founder compensation. So welcome to the panel. Welcome, everyone. And so before we get started, we want to get the audience engaged. And so as Sherry said, we have a poll question. So if you can go to the poll, we're going to ask the audience, what do you think is the number one challenge a CEO has with their board? And you can answer that question by texting. If you get your phones out and text, the number is 22333. And text Janine Buis 098. That would allow you to join. And then you can text your answers to what do you think, in one word, is the biggest challenge a CEO has with their board. And we're going to see this come up. So we'll give you a minute to do that. Preparation, alignment, expectations, communication, conflicts. Yes, great words. I think these are really interesting. Candor, alignment, expectations, communications. And what's interesting is they're all about the same level. So there's a lot of things to balance there. I think these are, we have strategy, control. These are all really interesting things and things that we're going to touch on in our conversation today. I think these are great. All right. So preparation, conflicts, trust, alignment, strategy, control, agility. Good word. Thank you, everyone. And now let's just dive right in. As we get started, let's start with you, Jeff, because I think one of the most important things is really to understand, why do we have a board? What is the role of a board of directors? And how does that differ, for example, from, say, a board of advisors?
Well, a board of directors is a very legal concept in corporations, whether in Delaware, New York, California. In limited liability companies, there's an equivalent concept. It can be called anything you want, but it's most often called the board of managers. But back to the board of directors, they literally direct the company. The power to control where the company goes is vested in the board of directors. And the board of directors literally, at least in legal words, delegates the authority to manage the day-to-day business to the officers. Now, sort of in my land, at the early stage areas, you have a founder who might be the sole stockholder, might be the only board member, and might be the only officer. He's wearing three hats, we like to say. I hate that phrase, but it works because you have to learn eventually that you're not going to be wearing all three hats by yourself. And as soon as you raise outside money, at least a substantial amount, usually about $1 million or more, you're going to have one of those lead investors or the investor take a board seat, a seat on your board. And at that point, you have someone, whether even if it is a 2-to-1 board, 2 common directors, 1 preferred director, so 1 venture capital director and 2 founders, you still have a responsibility to talk. You as a CEO has a responsibility to report to the board and to give the board information about what you're doing with the company, not just to manage their investments, because even though they are stockholders, as directors of the board itself is responsible for the business of the company. Now, what that means, we can talk about for 3 hours.
Right.
Plenty of literature on whether it's maximizing profits, maximizing short-term stockholder value, long-term stockholder value, maximizing what's known as ESG, environmental and social governance, which is very popular these days, especially with public companies. So it's all over the place. But fundamentally, the board of directors is responsible for maximizing whatever is in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. Now, what that means, and diving into those details, is, I guess, what we're going to talk about.
Exactly, how we're going to get there. Thanks, Jeff. So the board is responsible. I like the way you just summarized that. The board's responsible for the best interest of the company and its shareholders. So one of the key questions that often happens, and you started to allude to it, is who is on the board? It starts out, particularly for emerging growth stage companies, like the companies in the audience today, you start to have investors. And one of the things that we always hear about is the CEO should look at the investor based on who their representative is going to be on the board. So David, I'm going to ask you, talk about your board and how much say did you have in the board members on your board?
Sure. So we have 5 board members at Common Bond. I am one of them. Brian Hirsch, also on the panel, is another one of our board members. He, in fact, was the first, what I'll call professional outside capital that we brought into the firm, led our Series A round, and as part of that transaction, joined the board of Common Bond. And then as we raised additional rounds of funding, the lead investor of each of those rounds ended up joining our board. So when we raised our Series B, that was led by Tripp Jones at August Capital, and so Tripp joined our board as part of that round. When we raised our Series C, led by Neuberger Berman, Brian Smith from Neuberger Berman joined the board. And interestingly, when we raised our Series D, because that was led by a strategic partner, and that strategic partner still is a bank, based on certain legal and regulatory reasons, determined not to take an official seat on the board. And so between the 4 of us that I just mentioned and a 5th who has been an individual investor, mentor, advisor to me and to us from the very beginning, who I invited to join the board in, I think, 2014, Charles, he rounds out the board and makes us 5 in total. So the bottom line is the board in large part is made up by investors who lead various rounds of funding. And that's really what makes up the lion's share of the board.
And did who you went with for any of those fundings have an influence? Who was on the board, who was going to be on the board? Did that influence any of your decisions around which investors to go with?
It was pretty straightforward in our case. I knew Brian Hirsch for about a year by the time we ended up consummating our Series A, and he joined the board. And, in each of the rounds, it just kind of naturally congealed is the best way that I could say it. And I do feel fortunate, and I would say this whether Brian was on the panel or not, I do feel fortunate for the board that we have. Alignment came up, trust came up in that word cloud from before. And I do feel that just in talking to some of my compatriots, I might be a lucky one as it relates to having a board that tends to naturally align around things pretty easily. And if we're not immediately aligned, kind of figures out a path to get there relatively quickly.
That's great. So maybe Brian, sort of what's the thinking from the VC perspective when you're looking at making an investment? What kind of discussions, or how do you go about deciding who's going to sit on the board?
Yeah, I mean, internally, at least for us, we have different partners that focus on different areas generally. So areas of expertise. So for me, in this case, I've spent a lot of time investing in the fintech space, actually before it was called fintech, over 20 years. And so it was a natural for me to be the board member from our firm. So most venture firms try to choose the partner that's most likely to be able to help that company succeed long term. And in that case, I had the deepest experience in the segment.
How did you approach that? Sort of, what did you see as your job as the CEO in terms of your relationship with the board, and how did you approach that?
Yeah, I'll be very honest. Of all the things that I was thinking about and managing from the very early stage, the exact makeup of the board was not high on the list. What I was focused on was turning nothing into something and finding the capital, the financial capital and the human capital to help build out that vision. The board, in retrospect, almost happened, I don't want to say by happenstance, but as an externality of that focus, as opposed to a focus itself. Now, I mentioned before, I feel lucky, I feel fortunate that it ended up working out. I do feel like we have a very good, strong board of very experienced professionals who are deferential to management and wise about direction. And that's just a good place to be if you're the CEO, the founder, or both, to have a board that reflects those traits. So, in the early days, the focus was less about exactly the board makeup and more on just how do you build something and get the right capital, human and financial, in place.
Okay. Great. So then once you have the board in place, because that does just happen organically, how do you make, we talked about the importance of the board and playing a key role in the success and growth of the company. How do you make that board relationship work? Sort of what are some of the mechanics and sort of expectations sort of that you have and sort of Brian that you have and vice versa?
So some of the things that I have felt to be very important from the very beginning is communication. So keeping the board posted with what's going on. Now, in the early days, you kind of figure out what's the right level at which to inform the board. I think in the early days, you inform the board on a lot. And then over time, you realize, hey, there are certain things that you can and should focus on and operate as a management team and company that, frankly, the board doesn't need to be too concerned about. And then over time, as I said, you just calibrate to the right level of information that needs to be communicated between board and management team. I think once you calibrate to the level of information that needs to be informed, it's a matter of frequency, or the best way to call it is cadence. What's the right cadence of communication? Even if everything is going perfectly well, it's still important to have a strong cadence of communication with the board. So for example, we are a post-Series D company. And while it's typical for post-Series D companies to meet with the board every quarter, when I had the opportunity to choose to meet every quarter or every 2 months, so in other words, 4 times a year or 6 times a year, I chose 6 times a year. And the reason I chose 6 times a year, in part, is because I wanted to keep that connectivity strong, that even if no one thought about communication or cadence from there, we'd still have 6 meaningful, formal, and official times to connect as a broad board throughout the year. Between which I could always and do connect with individuals on the board on a one-off basis, ad hoc basis, as needed basis. That's kind of the high level structure. And then we kind of flex from there. Of course, and the final thing I'll say on this, but relevant to the times that we're in right now and the topic of this particular panel, in more difficult macroeconomic times or unpredictable times, I guess is the right way to say it, which is a world we live in right now, the cadence or frequency of communication likely, and in fact, in our case, has increased, I think, as a way to keep the board relationship strong. What you don't want to have happen if you're a founder or a CEO, I'll say it a different way. What you want to ensure as a founder, as a CEO, is that you're ahead of the communication curve, not behind it. So long as you're ahead of the communication curve, you're proactively informing the board, you're letting them know about things before they're hearing or asking or pressing or probing, that's a good place to be.
Brian, how does that fit with what you're, in terms of your expectations as a board member and from your CEOs in the portfolio and across the portfolio? Is that the way all the companies work?
Yeah, I wish they all worked that way. That's the way they should all work, I would say. And David does a great job. It really starts with that CEO. And David's a very structured and organized in the way he both manages the company, manages the board, and communicates. And I think a big part of it for us happens even before the investment, setting those expectations, making sure there's alignment. You know, I saw the word alignment, communication alignment really come together. I think the communication creates that alignment so that you know as a CEO and as a founder, you know, that you have alignment around what the mission and goals are for that company, both in the short, medium, and long term, and making sure that alignment continues as the information changes, you know, both externally in the market and internally at the company with its performance and operations and team. And I think the way to be effective is to continue that communication. And I think David made a great point. I think where founders and CEOs get into trouble with their boards is that lack of communication. It's trying to manage information, thinking that, oh, I don't want my investor to hear this bad news, or I don't, you know, or maybe I can sweep this under the rug and fix it, and they'll never know. I can go on with examples of things like that. And I think that's been an issue. You know, that's the primary issue, because that breaks down trust when board members start to hear things in the market, or you know, they're getting bad news late. That's a problem, right? It starts to tear away at that trust in the relationship. And if that trust, particularly you end up in an uncertain time like this, and that trust isn't there, it makes it incredibly hard to operate and get through a time of crisis.
You raised the point about alignment and communication and trust. One of the things I wanted to sort of pick up on is that alignment, because I think early on in a relationship, it's very easy to get that alignment and vision. And as you grow, David, you've gone to Series D, you know, what happens? And Jeff, maybe you can sort of chime in here in terms of, have you seen cases where that alignment doesn't always stay there, and then what?
Jeff, do you want to start in?
Sure, and I'm going to go back a couple letters in the alphabet towards the A or the B round. The Series D plus area is a really is a bit unique because, I mean, these are successful companies, and these are well established and extremely sophisticated companies, hopefully by that stage. Otherwise, a lot of people have made a lot of bad decisions to get to that place. But at the A stage, at the B stage, especially at the Series A stage, where it's really a CEO or founder's first time engaging with at least one or two professional investors. It's when you really are now, I like to tell first-time founders, like, this is really, someone just gave you $10 million. It's not their money anymore, but psychologically, you might want to think about it as their money, and you're going to want to keep them informed as to how you're deploying it. And that's on two levels. One, as you know, you want to speak to your major investors, and all your investors really, on one level. On a second level, there's the board, which is not just informing them, these are our financials, here's how we're using it, here's what we're doing, but there's going to the board and really involving them, whether it's 6 times a year. I think most investment documents will have a covenant at the company called at least quarterly board meetings, or at least 4 times a year. So having these board meetings and actually seeking advice and listening is when things get kind of difficult, because founders this might be the first time a founder hears something that they don't want to hear, that they may hear they have to furlough or fire some people because they got $20 million in a rockstar Series A with a $125 million valuation. They just built up this 15-person, 20-person, 30-person sales team, and a board member comes in and says, hold on, wait a second, you got to cut that down to 5. We need to build a product before we start selling it. And that might not have been the vision. They might not have had that discussion yet. And that's when you have those first bits of conflict, because it's really hard to fire someone. It's really hard to pivot. And when that's coming from the board, and it's coming after the financing, that can be a real source of tension. And you never want to start off with that kind of tension, even if it's good advice, which is why I think those conversations, I think, Janine, you were referring to this a little bit before, you want to have those conversations, even though you're not sort of focusing on it, but at the pre-financing stage where you're focusing on something other than the cap table. Even though you're focusing on the cap table more than anything else, you do want to say, okay, how are we going to use this money? And are we going to have a problem if we execute a vision that's slightly different? Yeah. That's really the first part where I see things start to get frayed. And of course, in addition to just not communicating with the board, taking the money and then never speaking to them again. That's obviously just whether it's done intentionally or more often, in fact, way more often unintentionally, unfortunately, is just not keeping your board in the loop. That's, of course, the number one reason relationships get frayed. But the second reason, where neither party is doing something wrong, is just when interests are not aligned.
Right. And getting that. And so, Brian, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think alignment of interests are key, and this is probably a whole separate call to discuss this. As companies evolve, different parties around the board table might have different interests, right? They're in a different cost basis. They might have different views of where the company's direction should go, their own careers. In my case, I started my firm and co-run it with my partner. But take another venture fund where it's a younger partner or partner 8 in a larger firm. There's a lot of political dynamics, and there could be chatter coming from the peanut gallery, the other partners about how that partner should or should not be managing that investment differently, and so all of that gets thrown into the boardroom, and many times the founder and CEO doesn't even fully understand where each of those board members may be coming from, because they don't have the full picture from inside that firm or that partnership. And that's just a very sort of complex topic to talk about. But it's really incumbent, I think, on that founder and CEO to educate themselves and try to understand, either by talking to other board members to get a view. If you have multiple investment funds, hey, I've seen that this partner X on the board was acting a certain way for the first year or two and seems to have changed their tone. What do you think might be behind that? You're in a venture fund. What could be happening at their venture fund? I think it's just asking those questions. And if you build the right relationship with your board members, you can have those questions without, feeling like you're going to be put into a penalty box for asking them. And I think that's critical to really understand, put yourself in the shoes of each of your investors and your board members, understand why they're coming at a particular issue or whatever topic a certain way, because sometimes that advice might be bad advice. And as a CEO and founder, you may not want to listen to it because it's being biased by the wrong thing, something that may not be the best thing for the company, but might be the best for the interest of that one investor, or they think it is. And so just wanted to add that point, because I think it's an important one.
Brian and David, did you say that one of the investors with a board seat on Common Bond's board was a strategic earlier, or is that the bank with that decline?
A strategic did lead one of the rounds, but for legal and regulatory reasons did not take a seat on the official board.
Well, do they have an observer seat? I imagine they must.
They do.
So, just as an example, as one of those, I think, easier to digest areas where you have board members who are both investors, or at least designated by investors, who have different end goals, would be a typical venture capital fund, and a strategic investor who is investing for different reasons. Potentially acquire the company, to monitor the company, not really for a rate of return. And that, I'm wondering if obviously you can't disclose too much, but or at least Brian, maybe you can sort of sum up all your knowledge where you've seen sort of VC directors and strategic directors sort of go at it and try to influence the CEO or management team one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, without giving a specific example, a specific company, I'll give this example because it's safer, which is when I started and ran a venture fund within the investment bank Greenhill, and one of our LPs was McGraw-Hill. I'm sure everyone knows who McGraw is. And shortly after they made that investment in the fund, the CEO had invited me to do a panel with one or two other people with the top 30 executives at McGraw-Hill. It was sort of some group that they got to advance learning from people from different areas, and it was really just a panel talking about how do large companies work with venture-backed companies, and what does that look like? And I walk through all the things that you might imagine, which is you don't want if you're making an investment in the startup, the startup has a vision. You don't want to hijack that company's vision for your own needs. And then there's a 45-minute to 1 hour discussion around the fact that, that you got to keep the integrity of what the company is doing, try to figure out how you make a successful partnership. At the end, I had a lot of people coming up to me, and pretty much all the questions were the same. So I heard everything you said, but how do I make sure if I'm involved with a startup, I get them to do what I need? And that the product goes in the direction I need, from McGraw-Hill. What's the method to do that? And that's the issue that you find in venture-backed companies sometimes, is that you have a product roadmap, and the strategic wants to hijack it, or they want you to go in a different direction, or they may want to buy you down the road, acquire you down the road, and they don't want you to get too expensive. And so they might push you in a different direction or away from a particular partner. And that's why, generally we don't love having strategics with formal board seats. Board observer seats can be okay, but there has to be a clear set of guidelines and rules going in that everyone abides by to make those relationships work.
How do you manage that balance between the board meeting becoming sort of a rah-rah, sort of like a cheerleading session for the CEO, or the other extreme would be that it just becomes a pure sort of performance evaluation, or sort of, we're going to just drill through how are you performing and what are you doing? What's the right balance, sort of? And David, how do you get the right balance to get what you need out of that meeting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that too requires some calibration over time. What's the right balance? I think is the right word. The balance between what's going well and what could be going better. The direction I give to my team when we prepare for any board meeting is put on the page what's accurate. So what's happening, and be as data-driven as possible. So no editorializing, no big superlatives, just what are the facts? And then we shape the facts in an honest and accurate way to reflect as balanced a picture as possible. So the keywords you've heard from me already are accurate, fact-based, and balanced. That to me seems to be a really good frame to take into any board meeting, frankly, any board communication, just because it's a high bar to meet, the board communication. A very high bar to meet. And I feel like when we do those three things, we deliver to the board and therefore serve the company well, as best we can. It tends to lead to the best discussions that we have, both in terms of, some of the necessary back patting that a team sometimes needs to hear that's motivating, positive reinforcement, but also really deep and detailed conversations about how to make something work better than it is right now. Recognizing that there's a brain trust around that table that have seen a lot in the past. I think on our board, if I do the rough math, there's close to 100 years of experience on the board, and it's just 5 people. How do we best tap into that in as productive a way as possible?
And that's your job to sort of try and figure out how to structure that conversation to be able to do that. Yeah, we see that the work Sherry and I do with our CEOs, like getting that what you talked about, the fact base and the structure and the framework is really important. And giving the CEO and having the confidence in the numbers and giving numbers that you can be confident delivering to the board is one of the biggest things that a CEO or founder has to do, as well as the story behind it. Right. And to have the confidence in terms of where and what do we need to do to achieve those numbers, and where do we need help, right? How can you help us to do that? I think that's really a critical thing. Now let's talk a little bit about sort of COVID. So, this is great. We've had, everything runs smoothly and you start to build that board relationship, and then you have something like the coronavirus pandemic hit. How did that change the dynamics and the relationship with the board? And how did you sort of structure that? What happened? What did you do?
So, I go back to the frame I was using before around what's the appropriate cadence with the board. And we have the baseline frame, which in our case is a board meeting every 2 months. And then an occasional connect with individual board members from there. That's the base. But then depending on what's happening, either inside the company or outside the company in a macro sense, that cadence can flex up or down. really doesn't flex down. It only flex up from there. So in a time of COVID, we got to a point where I was updating the board every day or every other day, just because there was so much happening. There was so much new information that everybody's dealing with, including board members, right? Because this is a difficult time for everybody, no matter what they do professionally, no matter who they are personally. There's just so much massive, severe, and sudden change. We're human beings at the end of the day. That is hard to process. And I recognize that or Common Bond is just one small piece in every board's professional and personal life. And that one small, spoke in the life, I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to serve up as much sense, as much data, as much perspective as possible with an appropriate level of frequency, so that as things continue to move suddenly, as things continue to move severely, this is a part of an board member's life that they need to worry about less. And they know exactly what's going on and why it's going on and what we plan on doing next, and leaving open a space to hear feedback, to be challenged, to hear encouragement, whatever it is, just informing the board and creating a space for the board to talk and discuss anything that they want.
And I like what you were saying about the empathy in terms of realizing that a board member has a lot of other things going on. And for example, take you, Brian, you have 16 investments that you're responsible for, and then you have something like this. What does that mean from your perspective?
I had a full head of hair before the 16 board. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm well trained at this point. It's almost like being like a fighter pilot. I think all the information's coming at you. That's what COVID has felt like for me. And not right at this moment, but definitely the first 4 to 6 weeks. It's just there's planes flying all around me. There's bullets flying. I don't know if they're from friendlies or from enemies. You're just trying to get your bearings. And so it's overwhelming. And so you just, and Dave and I just recently talked about this. I think we both operate similarly. It's like, you don't panic. You just say, okay, well, what's the next thing that you have to do in front of you? You do the next thing, you solve the problem one step at a time, to the extent there is a problem. And that's it. I mean, it's just, you do the work. But I think some of the things that David just touched on are really important. And I think having a healthy board relationship going into a crisis makes it much easier, right? So being able to have those open conversations and get that feedback is much easier when there's already that trusted relationship. There's already good communication. David and his team knows that they can share bad news and they're not getting beaten up over it, right? It's like, okay, bad things happen in companies, every company, even the best one. And you just work through it. Okay, well, how did that happen? How do we solve it? What resources do we need to solve it? How quickly can we solve it? And you move on. Try not to get emotional about it and just deal with it. I think in the cases, and we have these in our portfolio, and I've had them in my career, in the cases where you don't have that relationship, where the trust maybe was broken along the way. And typically it's because of some lack of transparency or poor communication prior to that moment. It does become more challenging in times like this. And I think it's hard to get through. And I think the key is just to over communicate, right? You almost need to go 3x over whatever you were doing before and own the fact that there were issues. I would to the extent someone's listening and they have a problem with their board, I would call that board member or those board members that you have an issue with and just plainly speak about that. Call it out, because there's no time right now to have the politics and everything. The company won't survive, right? Or survive it. You have to deal with every issue head on immediately. Not tomorrow, not in a week, not in a month, like immediately, like today. Whoever is listening should get off and call their board member when we're done with this for that reason. And say, hey, I know in the past we've had issues with communication. If we're going to get through this, we're going to have to get through this together. And let's talk about what those issues are. We may not be able to solve all of our issues, our relationship issues, but let's get far enough along that we can at least work these problems and get through the other side for the benefit of the company, which we all want to see succeed. I think that's a very straight conversation that should happen if you have a board issue, at the current moment.
One of the things that this is a really trying time, and one of the things that can happen when you have varying board interests at this stage of the game as well, and how do you deal and move forward. So I think your communications about get on the phone and talk to your board members about understanding where they're coming from is really important, because they've also got other stakeholders, as David, you mentioned, really understanding what their perspectives are and bringing. So maybe one of the questions I see a question coming in, and let me ask this. So Chris Ramanathan has a question. What do you consider the responsibility of a board member to support the management team vis-a-vis a difficult board member? So tied right into what we were talking about.
Yeah, I'm happy. So every board takes a different approach. Depends on where the difficult board member is coming from and what's the source, both where they sit on the board. I need more specific circumstances, but I've been on boards that have had, problematic board members, whether it's co-investors or strategics or independents or all of the above. And my approach has always been for me to take it head on and try to deflect as much as I can from the founder and CEO, and take the bullets, right? So I've had situations where at least my approach has been to maybe go more direct, because I have less to lose at that other board member, and shield the CEO if I see bad behavior, and I'll do that one-on-one. I may do that in a group forum if it's required. Yeah. And that's just, something that has to happen. I've had situations where it's very clear a board member has been so destructive to a company that we've tried to work, legally to get them off the board, or gone to a partnership and said, hey, your partner is causing some issues. Those are rare occurrences, but sometimes you have to take extreme measures. If the damage is so great to the company that the company can't do its business, then something has to be done. But legally, as I'm sure Jeff could share, once a director has rights to a board seat, it's very, very tricky to navigate and remove someone that's problematic, and legally remove them.
100%. It is the nuclear option to take the train down to Delaware and actually prosecute a lawsuit. People can allege in these sort of toxic situations, people can allege breaches of fiduciary duty and breaches of loyalty and conflicts of interest. And that will happen. Very, very rarely, even more rarely, will someone draft a complaint about it. And even more rarely will a complaint actually be filed. An attempt to remove that board member, or ask the Chancery Court to allow a sale to go through anyway because someone is, for bad reasons or for ignorant reasons, violating their duties to the company. It does happen. I think maybe once a year I see it. But out of dozens, probably 100 of companies I come across a year, it's in that situation, it only happens about 1% to 2% of the time. Most of the time, it's what Brian said. Usually an ally of the founder, an ally of the CEO, is not just a friend of the CEO, but someone who really understands the journey the company has gone through, really understands the whole picture, will take a certain recalcitrant or sort of bad faith board member or board observer aside and say, hey, listen, let's approach this a different way. Let's approach this in a more productive way. And as Brian sort of referred to as well, sometimes more senior partners at VC funds may go over that person's head. That's a little bit aggressive as well, almost as aggressive as a lawsuit, because that can hurt people's political capital. But that also has happened, and that sometimes it needs to happen. And sometimes it's not just the board member helping the founder out. I kind of want to go back to what I spoke about the first thing, which was they're just doing their jobs. The board is responsible for the company. Each board member individually has duties to the best interest of the company. So when they go over someone's head, when they talk to counsel, which they don't do often enough, I guess, because sometimes we're thrown in at the very tail end of this, they're not doing it because they're maybe they're doing it because they're friendly with the founder, but they're also doing it to satisfy their duty of care and their duty of loyalty to the company, because it is their job to see that the company is in the best position for management to make it succeed. And if a board member is holding that up, they are obligated to do whatever reasonably is possible to put the company back on track.
Right. So that's always, I think the best interest of the company is kind of the right thing. I think we have and I think that's an important part. How do you manage the best interests of the company? There's a question about board member communications with other key executive members like CFO, CHRO, and general counsel. And maybe David, you can start with this in terms of kind of what's your approach thinking about you from your team's perspective, and then we can talk maybe Brian about what your expectations are as a board member.
I think that in the management of anything, it's important to concentrate ownership and accountability. That's how we run the company. When we have very important focus areas in the business, I want to make sure we have one person who ultimately owns it and ultimately is accountable. I apply that same standard to myself as relates to the board. It's very important, I believe, in the company to have a singular source of ownership and accountability between board and management, and that's me. That allows me, one, to manage the board and for the board to work with the management team in the most effective way. Two, it makes very clear where ownership and accountability is. Three, it also allows me to prevent distraction for my people. So anything that needs to happen at the board level, I want my team focused on delivering financial results for the company. And we've aligned as a company, we've aligned as a board. And so in the ongoing nature of it, I want to prevent my team from being distracted in any sense. And this is one of them. The final thing I'd say, all that said, is the board management relationship is an important one. It's also an opportunity whereby it's an opportunity to elevate and showcase certain executives inside the firm. It's, there's an opportunity to give folks on the executive team, time with the board, engagement with the board. It's important for executives to feel that, experience that. It's also important, I think, for board members to hear that, see that, feel that, sense that. It gives a stronger sense of, I think, the breadth and depth of the company and its people, breadth and depth of perspective and kind of operating levers that we're pulling. And so again, it comes back to this word I mentioned before, it's a balance. So on the one hand, it's important to concentrate ownership and accountability, at the CEO level between board and team, for all the reasons discussed. But it's also important to elevate your executive team vis-a-vis the board and vice versa, in highly thoughtful and intentional ways.
What happens when you have a very strong personality founder? What happens if you have like either the superstar type CEO and perhaps even think about, we've seen these examples, WeWork, Uber. How does the board deal with those dynamics?
I think that's case specific to the personality. Is probably the right answer there. I think as an investor, going into a company, you kind of, you get a sense of, I talk about this all the time. It's like a marriage, when you leave at least the Series A investment, such a long-term relationship. And so, I try to think about those things before I make the investment, not have to deal with them post-investment. So if I think there's some sort of personality that's going to be an issue, then we probably wouldn't invest in the first place. But if we made that mistake and ended up in the situation where we're on the board with maybe it may be a great founder, but someone that you just can't work with, I'm not sure that's where the question's coming from. But if the founder has control, you just gotta live with it, manage it the best you can. I mean, that's the honest truth, and try to be helpful as much as you can. And I think, part of it is just showing value over time, right? I think most people, if they see that you're bringing value to the table, and you're helping them advance their vision, a founder, regardless of their personality, they're likely to be more open and be willing to work with you in a collaborative way. But yeah, I mean, there's just some founders and CEOs that are going to have a cult of personality to them that's going to be so strong and overwhelming that, the board's almost along for the ride. And if things go bad, as they have in certain situations, WeWork being a high profile example, there's not much, you could do. It's really about the voting and the control at the board level. And if you don't have it, you don't have it. I'm not sure I have a better answer than that.
Exactly. It's an upfront negotiation. If you don't, ultimately, when an investor asks for a board seat, it's asking for aspect of a control right. They're asking to control the company in a certain way. So if you have a board seat, but you don't have any special things that require your affirmative vote, such as founder salaries, capital expenditures over a certain threshold, if you don't actually have the control, if you're just one vote out of 5, and the founder is also another CEO, also another board member, and has all 3 other people, and you don't have any special veto rights, there's really nothing you can do. That's why you got to negotiate for them up front, if you can. Sometimes you can't, especially with a very popular, very marketable, very outspoken and very popular CEO who may end up not being that in the future. But Brian's exactly right. If you didn't get it up front, you can't really get it at the end.
Okay, I think that, and we have another question. Thanks, Jeff. Question in terms of, this is more specifically related to, I guess, decision making and what we were talking about in terms of, especially around compensation, given the current times. Have boards given up any or all or compensation during COVID in support of management and staff taking cuts, or how has this balance between maximizing, helping the companies through this from a financial perspective?
They really shouldn't have any for a traditional venture-backed company. There should, maybe for an independent industry expert, there might be some options. I've seen some cash compensation. That's almost as rare as a lawsuit. They really shouldn't have any compensation. Just the privilege of serving on the board is compensation enough. I
want to get from each of you sort of a summary of sort of what do you see as the top 1 or 2 things if you're talking to a CEO and in helping them, counseling them in terms of how do you build a productive board relationship, and let's say it's a new founder, a new CEO. What's your guidance? What's the top 2 things that you would say to them?
I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but this is what I've done that I would add on that list of 2 or put on that list of 2. One is I have a profound respect for the capital that we received from our investors. And I would call it, profoundly respectful and even deferential to that. It's a fine balance. You can't be too deferential. You still got to run the company and take it in a particular direction. But never lose sight of the hand that feeds you is something that I think is deeply in the recesses of my mind. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, and it's tied to something we had talked about a little earlier, and that is seek data. So the question that came up before was, what happens if you have someone on your board who isn't who's acting up, right? I was reflecting upon that question as it was being answered, and even though I don't think we're probably a good example of when that has happened, I started thinking about how I would approach it. And I think it's, to the founders out there listening, it's how you would approach any other problem in an ideal way. You want to seek data. You want to seek information. In that particular case, I would go to the individual to understand what was going on. And then I would go to other people with other perspectives and other fact bases and ask them what they thought was going on. The whole point in saying all this is seek data, develop a view, and make a decision. So as it relates to a board or board dynamics, I would apply that just like any other problem. Seek data, look for understanding. Once you have perspective, make a call. And to my first point, never lose sight of the fact that your board very likely has given you the capital you need to do what you want. So always make sure you're balancing things.
Know your audience.
Yeah.
Your customer. Yeah. Okay. Brian?
Yeah, for me, I think the first thing that comes to mind is partnership. That a founder and CEO needs to understand that while the CEO reports to the board, it really is about a partnership, and that you need to think about getting into that relationship that way, right? It's a long-term partnership, and it's going to be one of the most influential partnerships on the future outcome of your business, whether you like it or not. And so it's really important to invest in that partnership early, understand who you're entering into that partnership with, do your work, get the data on the front end, try to understand as best you can where that firm or that investor and that individual is coming from, and how they view the company, where they think the company is likely to go, what their expectations are, making sure there's alignment of expectations, both on the cadence and the way that the relationship will, this partnership is going to go, but also, where the company's vision, making sure that your vision as a founder and CEO is fully aligned with what the investor or board member's vision is for the company. We view it as, when we back a company, we're basically putting a stamp saying, like, we sign off and support the founder's vision for where the company is going to go. And we try to get them on board with the same expectations of how far they want to take it. So for us, we seek founders that want to build and scale very large companies over time. And sometimes the reality doesn't match the goals at the front end, and that's okay. That's the way the world works. But thinking that you're going in a different direction, if you're going in a different direction from day one, that makes it really hard to succeed. And so getting that alignment and having that partnership really work well is critical. And it's then that communication up front is the key. I think we're repeating the same themes because they are the most important ones.
Okay, great. And Jeff, we're sort of getting close to the top of the hour. So anything?
Right. Keeping it real quick, just communication, but not just repeating communication over and over again. Establishing a process for communication. So making sure calendar invites are sent out months, perhaps even years in advance for quarterly board meetings. Making sure you have an agenda and financials ready days before the board meetings. In writing, sort of a whole discussion prepared. Make sure if you're having executives present, make sure they're prepared. Do a mock interview or a mock board meeting with your chief of product who may never have been in a board meeting before. They're presenting, or your CFO, or any executive is going to be there. Just prepare, and establish a process to make it easy. Once you make it easy, you're going to be more eager to do it. And when you're more eager to do it, you're actually going to do it.
I think that's great advice, all of you, in terms of, how do you make that relationship work, and preparation and communication are critical. I think the audience today sort of has gotten some excellent input in terms of what they can do and guidance on how to build that relationship. I want to thank you very much for participating today. It was great to have you. And just before we leave, I'm going to ask Sherry to put up a slide on our next event, and which is coming up, which I think all of you would be very, very interested in. Over to you, Sherry. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Janine, and everybody did such a great job. Enjoyed this so much. Just wanted to share with everybody that we have another upcoming CEO Morning Jolt coming up on June the 3rd. It is 10 a.m., June the 3rd. Mark it down on your calendars. It's not always up and to the right, the $1 billion NetSuite story. We have Deborah Farrington, who's the managing partner at StarVest Partners, who is the original investor at NetSuite, and Evan Goldberg, who was the founder of NetSuite, working out that deal with Larry Ellison, who is now the executive vice president at Oracle NetSuite Global Business Unit. They sold the NetSuite to Oracle for $9.1 billion. So we're going to hear the whole story, how it got started, how it got funded, and how they rose up and down the different times of crisis. Between since 1998, there's been a number of crises, in terms of 9/11 and the 2001 dot-com bubble and the 2008 financial crisis and now the pandemic. So how is NetSuite doing it? How are they emerging as the number one or the leader in business solutions in the cloud? So looking forward to having you all there as well. Janine?
Thank you, Sherry, and thank everyone. Thank you, David, Brian, Jeff, for participating today. Great advice. Great to have you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us in the audience. And have a great day. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
everyone. Bye for now.